Welcome to the Art Studio Insights podcast, where we demystify the creative process and exchange ideas with career-minded artists. We are your hosts, Adriana M.A. and
Jackie Sanders. We are two emerging artists sharing forth the advice and business lessons we have learned along our journey. So if you're not already, please go ahead and subscribe. This will help other creatives like you find our podcast, and you'll be notified when we drop a new episode every Tuesday. So this week's topic, we're going to be talking about overanalysis paralysis and what to do when the inner critic takes over your art making practice. But Adriana, what have you been up to this week?
So we have both been welcoming new members into the Level Up Artists community, which if you're hearing this on the day that the podcast is released, which is on July the 13th, it will be opening, or it will be closing. I'm sorry. It'll be closing at midnight tonight, Eastern time. So if you're listening to this when we release it, you still have a little bit more time to join us in a community of career-minded artists. Where you can get advice from professionals and course modules on everything from social media to marketing and sustainable studio practices. So we hope you'll join us.
Yeah, so if you haven't joined already, you can go to www.levelupartist.com. All the information is right there. You can also sign up there. You do have to put the www in the beginning of it, or else it'll throw an error. But all the information is online. And as always, you can send either of us a DM on Instagram, and all of that information will be in the show notes. It has been so much fun getting to know some of the artists in there and welcoming them in this week. I was actually at the beach this week, and so that was even more fun because it was almost like bringing the creative community that we have at our art studio along with me, which is that's the whole point, right? Is like to stay connected with creatives no matter where you are. If you're in different states, if you're on another side of the country, having this community right at your fingertips has been so much fun. And so hopefully you guys will join us.
Absolutely.
But yeah, while I was at the beach, I actually was reading, listening to an audiobook. I typically try to take a creative book with me when I go on vacation. I do not always have a lot of time, especially this trip was a family vacation. So it was a lot of activities and so much fun. But when I did have some downtime, either early in the mornings or when I was driving there and home, I was listening to the audiobook from Elizabeth Gilbert from a book called Big Magic. I don't have her on now because I didn't want to get wet at the ocean. But it's a super cool book in terms of shifting your creative mindset. And so for today's episode, we're talking about overanalysis paralysis and the art making process. There's an excerpt that I wanted to share with you guys to kind of kick us off. Yes. So in the physical book, it's on page 25. In the chapter called Courage. So here we go. Again, this is from Elizabeth Gilbert. Dearest Fear, creativity and I are about to go on a road trip together. I understand you'll be joining us, as you always do. I acknowledge that you believe you have an important job to do in my life and that you take your job very seriously. Apparently, your job is to induce complete panic whenever I'm about to do anything interesting. And may I say, you're superb at your job. So by all means, keep doing your job if you feel that you must. But I will also be doing my job on this road trip, which is to work hard and stay focused. Creativity will be doing its job, which is to remain stimulating and inspiring. There's plenty of room in this vehicle for all of us, so make yourself at home, but understand this. Creativity and I are the only ones who'll be making any decisions along the way. I recognize and respect that you are part of this family, and so I will never exclude you from our activities, but still, your suggestions will never be followed. You're allowed to have a seat, you're allowed to have a voice, but you are not allowed to have a vote. You're not allowed to touch the road maps, you're not allowed to suggest any detours, and you're not allowed to fiddle with the temperature. Dude, you're not even allowed to touch the radio. But above all else, my dear old familiar friend, you are absolutely forbidden to drive. And I absolutely loved this excerpt because, of course, being on a family road trip, of course, there's like a million cooks in the kitchen. when people are trying to figure out plans, it really resonated with me and how true that is with the creative process, because we all, I don't know about you guys, I'm not going to make a generalizing statement. I always have like a million voices going on in my head at one time.
No, absolutely. And I mean, that's a book. Honestly, I read it a few years ago, and that part that you just read has been one of the things that has stuck with me after all this time. Is that whole idea of when that inner critic, you feel like it's taking over, you're just like, no, no, you're going in the back seat,
Like, get back there.
backseat driver, you don't get to say anything. Like, yeah, sure, you're there, like almost
Right.
like fear is part of our DNA, right? Like it's a
Yeah.
survival instinct, mechanism, but it doesn't have to take over your creative process. It's a matter of acknowledging it. Yes, easier said than done, but it's basically like, okay, I see you back. You're sitting back there. Like,
Right. Exactly.
you just can't. Yeah. But something that comes up in conversation, right, as creatives is, how do you know when your inner critic is trying to take over, right? Like, what
Right.
signs do you see where you're like, uh-oh, someone's trying to touch the radio of said vehicle.
Right, exactly. And I think her analogy is perfect because, yeah, it's like they might not even be driving per se, but they're getting kind of close. And one sure tell sign for me, which I think we've even made fun of on this podcast, and I have just learned to recognize it, is I am a total reorganizer. And that's my like productive procrastination, as I call it. Sometimes it's when I have like a creative idea that's still marinating that I'm trying to work through. So it almost gives me something to do with my hands while I'm thinking through it. And that I feel like is productive. However, there are other times where I'm like, why do I have this tunnel vision of having to organize this shelf when I could have been spending an hour doing something else? That's when it's the inner critic. You're clearly avoiding doing something that I know I should be doing, which that's obviously not a great thing.
You said that, and all I can think about is kind of like on my end, how I know it's showing up is, well, I get distracted, right? And I start oogling these different art supplies that I don't really need right now. And maybe it's other disciplines and other hobbies. And suddenly the time I had for painting, I've spent it going down these rabbit holes of some tangent thing that may still feed into the work. Don't get me wrong. Like, I'm
Right.
always going to try to find a link back. It's not just, wasted into the ether. Um, but if I find that I'm like continually doing that instead of
Yeah.
painting, then I'm like, uh-oh, okay, if it's been a few days and I'm still doing something else, and the ideas that we're going to marinate have already marinated. In fact, they're getting overcooked, and I'm still doing that other thing, or shiny
Right.
object syndrome. Then it's like, uh-oh, inner
Ugh.
critic is yeah,
Yeah.
it's definitely going for the radio, and then we know what happens next. They'll come into the front seat. So
Yeah. And I think that's a common, almost misconception of the inner critic. Mine is not very literal in terms of like voices that it's saying, but it almost appears as those productive ways, like, or productive procrastination, where you almost convince yourself that, oh, no, 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 I'm not avoiding it. I'm doing something productive. I'm researching. I'm diving into this. I'm insert excuse here. But you're like, okay, well, why am I actually avoiding it? And where is that need to avoid it coming from? Which I think brings us to the next topic of like the inner critic, of what does your inner critic actually say when it's manifesting itself?
Ooh. Well,
Yeah.
mine is kind of on the vocal side of things. Not really. It's just a better way to kind of, understand what's going on, right? But
Yeah.
it gets to this crossroad, right? So not only is the shiny object syndrome in full force, right, with other things
Yeah.
popping up, but then on top of that, I get to this crossroads of overwhelm, right? And analysis paralysis. You're just like, there's too many choices. I mean, it's like decision fatigue. Like, what am I going to do next? And it almost feels like, if it had an actual voice, it would be saying something along the lines of like, you can't take those risks and experimenting with these other things. That's too
Yeah.
vulnerable. Who do you think you are? Oh, you think you can paint that too? Well, that's really different. Do you think anybody's going to recognize that? I mean, it can be a little bit on the negative side. But essentially, yeah, that's usually how I feel like it starts to, manifest itself, is kind of you start getting that feeling of like, I, I don't know if I should go this way or this way or this way or this way. And like
Yeah,
you
you
just
just
need
get
to take that
overwhelmed.
pause and yeah, figure out and actually recognize that you're overwhelmed before you can move to the next step.
Right, exactly. And I think we talked about that last episode really well, and how like focusing on multiple art styles, that can almost be the manifestation of the inner critic, right? And especially for me, I love being a beginner. I'll say, have said that multiple times. I love discovering a new process, learning about it, exploring it, and then, all right, I'm bored with this. Let me go on to the next thing, which of course is not great in the creative process in terms of focusing in. But I think a lot of that stems from, and pushing through that needs to stem from, I have this inherent fear of being incompetent, and always feeling like I have to prove myself to other people and not being enough for whatever their false expectations are of me, or these made up ones that I have in my head, when realistically, they're probably not even thinking about this. I am really just trying to overcompensate for the fear of not being good enough by hustling and working a lot and X, Y, and Z, filling up my plate with a million things, which inevitably leads to burnout, which is a totally real thing, and something that, if you pride yourself on your work ethic, is really hard to admit when you're burning out. But I think the real reason for that is, okay, why did I feel like I had to get to the point of working this hard? And a lot of that comes from that inner critic. What are those inherent fears that you're projecting onto other people when realistically, they're not even worried about you? They're off doing their thing. And you're just like, oh, well, they're not going to think I'm competent enough. And they're like not even thinking about you. It's all in your head. It's so silly.
I know. And it's almost like, I mean, this is a good thing, right? Of having other friends that are also in creative endeavors, because then you'll bring it up and they're like, oh, me too. But no, I wasn't thinking about that. Like, I
Yeah.
never thought of it, like, if you're like, I'm not competent enough. I'm like, are you kidding? You're one of the hardest working artists I have ever met. And I've met a lot of artists. So it's kind of like that's, obviously without going too much into a tangent, but that is definitely one thing, really good thing about having other creative friends
Oh,
or
yeah.
artists in your network. They'll help you with a little bit of that, but
Right.
supposing that is not something that's in your life yet, which is fine, right? One step at a time. Let's discuss. Okay, so you're starting to feel the inner critic take over. That's step one. Step two, you've already identified how it manifests itself, right? So first you're like, uh-oh, is this happening? Secondly, you're like, no, it really is happening, right? So we've kind of identified how it shows up. So what should we do about it? What do you think, Becky?
I think that's almost the hardest step. After you recognize it, you're like, all right, now what? So, one quote that had really stuck with me, I guess there's two main ones. So, the first one for me is, stop shoulding all over yourself. So, I should do this. I should do that. I should be here by this point. Why am I not there yet? How come I'm not competent? They got here. I should be there too. It's like, no, these are all these false expectations that you're taking on. Maybe some of them are rooted in comments you heard 5 years ago. Maybe it's a comment that someone who's not even part of the art world, doesn't know anything about an art business, saying, oh, you should have your art listed here, here, and here, and you should be at this market, and you should be doing this, you should be doing that. You'd be like, they aren't part of your art business or your art world. So stop taking that on as your own baggage. Focus on yourself. What is the next thing that you can do to get you to where you want to be? Which I think then ties into this second quote that has really stuck with me of, focus on the verb, not the noun. So rather than focusing on what you think being an artist is, focus on making art. rather than focusing on, oh, I need to be the best marketer for my business, take action on a marketing plan. You take it in small bites, and then eventually, oh, look, I just made this complete series of artwork because I focused on art, rather making art, the verb of it, rather than these weird expectations or shoulds of the art world that I take on. And then you end up not doing anything, over analysis paralysis, and 2 months goes by and you haven't done anything. So those are my two big ones. Stop shooting all over yourself. And yes, it sounds funny, but also two, focus on the verb, not the noun.
Yeah. And that last one, it definitely reminds me of, if you're documenting the things that you are doing in your business, you can look back and be like, holy, I did so many different tasks. Like if you're documenting the type of tasks that you're doing to move your business forward, that's a really easy way. I feel like shutting that, inner critic where they're like, oh, well, you should have done this, you could have done that. And you're like, well, I did. I sent these many emails. I did this many exhibitions,
right.
And then you put it in perspective and it's like, oh, I actually did a lot. It didn't feel like a lot, but once you see it on paper or digital, right, once you see it listed out, then I think that helps.
Yeah.
So I love those. I definitely agree with those. And another one I would add from my end. Okay. I'm sure you've all heard that saying about it takes 10,000 hours to master anything, right? I think it's Maxwell. Don't quote me on that one. That said that one, right? Well, you're not going to make 10,000 hours worth of masterpieces, are you now? During some of that time, there's probably going to be a lot of things that trash can. So the way I see it is, when the inner critic shows up, oh, you're not good enough about this, or who do you think you are trying to experiment with this other thing? Like nobody's going to recognize your style, like blah, blah, blah. Whenever those things come out, it's like, you just keep working, honestly. Like that's the way I push through the inner critic and I shush it up, because I'm going to go, and we've talked about this in a previous episode, but the way I see it, I'm like, I'm going to go, okay, I'm a beginner right now, or this is new to me, whatever it is that I'm, merging together. It's like we're cooking, right? It's like we're scientists. We're putting all these things together as creatives, right? Mm-hmm. And I just look at it like, okay, well, the first time that you cook lasagna, it's not going to taste great, probably, especially if you're doing it by yourself, right? Like you're learning, you're still learning. But the more you do it, the better you get at it, right? So for me, I'm like, the way I put my inner critic in its place is like, yeah, I know it looks like crap, whatever. The next 99 is gonna look, whatever, until I get to the point where I'm like, oh, there's the diamond right there. But you got to go through a lot of dirt to get to the good stuff, right? So for me, when the inner critic shows up, I'm just like, I'm just gonna keep going through it, like, yeah, sure, I'll listen. Yeah, whatever. Just stay back there. Like you can't.
Yeah, exactly. And that's just like practice makes better. And that actually ties in perfectly. I just remembered my professor in college gave me that very similar advice. And he was basically saying, if you're ever feeling stuck, then just make more art. If you're stuck on one piece, maybe go start 2 or 3 more. And then by having that active hand, that's when the inspiration is going to come. That's when the breakthrough is going to come. And then it'll solve the problem. You can't overanalyze a situation and get all in your head. That's only going to make it worse. Like just make more art.
Yeah, just keep plugging through it, and obviously don't burn yourself out. Take breaks as needed, but yeah, don't let that stop you. No matter what the inner critic, right, wants to bring onto the table.
Yeah, and I feel like that goes perfectly back to Elizabeth Gilbert's quote, where it's like, you can acknowledge that fear is in the car. You can acknowledge that it may dial the radio a few times. It may make a suggestion of a detour, but you can acknowledge it, say, be quiet, take your back seat. You are here and you're along the ride, but you're not driving. And so I think that's a huge growth that I had, was like, it's okay to acknowledge fear. Don't beat yourself up that you have an inner critic voice. Acknowledge it, move past it, and just keep making more artwork.
Yeah. and also know that it will probably never go away. I mean, that doesn't sound very reassuring, but you learn to live with it. Like
Right.
it's part of the way we're built. It is what it is, and that's okay. Yeah, it takes time. We're just gonna throw it with that. All right, so that's a wrap on today's episode, and we really hope you enjoyed this conversation.
As always, both of our blogs will be linked in the show notes, where you can find episode notes from today's episode, a link to Elizabeth Gilbert's book, as well as links to all other episodes that we've released on previous Tuesdays.
Yeah, and if you want to stay connected with us in between episodes, share what you have learned, you can follow us on social media. Ame Art on all platforms.
And I'm J Sanders Studio on all platforms. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.